Good afternoon, live from Toronto on the GBCAM network. Welcome to a special episode of the Chat Up Show. Today we're going to be discussing pressing matters right now, which is the federal elections, the 2021 federal elections. We are just 9 days away from Election Day. And this past week, we have had the debates from the candidates, leaders of each party. And so joining me to discuss the elections this year is very special guest, Romaine Redmond, who is our political analyst right here on GBCAM Network, and Ms. Andrea Barrett, who is NDP candidate for Brampton South. Welcome to the Chat Up Show.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thanks for having us.
Of course.
Thank you so much.
I kind of want to just dive into the debates from this past week. We had the French language debate on Wednesday evening and the English language debate on Thursday. What were each of your initial thoughts of the debate? I'm going to start with you, Andrea.
Very telling. So I didn't see the French debate, but the Thursday debate, I started off in the car listening to it, and then because there were no commercial breaks, ran from the car inside just so I could hear. I thought the questions were very good. I enjoyed hearing the answers. I know a lot of people had some issue with the moderator style and the format, but I didn't have a problem with it at all. I was as a Black woman running in the provincial election, I was very happy to see a Black woman up on stage representing her party, leading her party. So I thought there were some very telling answers and some non-answers. And overall, I thought it was a very good debate.
I'm gonna probe you on the telling answers there in just a second. But Romaine, what were your initial thoughts?
I must say first, let me just start by acknowledging what you said, that indeed it was a refreshing scene to see a Black woman stand on the stage to represent her party so eloquently. Let me put that out there first. She was eloquent in her responses. But as for gaining from the election, so I look at debates essentially as like, what does the voters, what do they earn or gain from what has been said by the leaders? I mean, we've seen this style of politics so many times. It's you didn't do or you should have done what I'm going to do. And it wasn't so much in depth on each platform. So I was looking for the arguments to be laced with things from the platforms. I was looking for those numbers. I was looking for those projections. I was looking for those tangible policies to be brought up in each response. And for many of it, I did not see that. But eloquence was definitely the theme of the night.
So just going over who was present at the debate, we had Green Party leader Annamie Paul, Liberal leader Justin Trudeau, who is our Prime Minister, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, Conservative leader Erin O'Toole, and Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet. So we had, a spectrum of opinions. But as Romaine, you mentioned that you were really looking for essentially the facts to back up the claims of you're not doing this, you're not doing that. One thing particularly that was brought up is, of course, COVID recovery currently. We're still in the middle of a pandemic. What were your thoughts on that conversation, starting with Andrea?
I think the elephant in the room is, why are we even having an election during the fourth wave of a pandemic? That's the question. There's no doubt we're still living in a pandemic. Is this the right time to have called an election? And I was pleased to see that many of the politicians on stage had asked that question to the Liberal leader. Why are we doing this now? Clearly, COVID is still an issue. There's healthcare issues, there's funding issues. So I think that was important that came up, and it put the Liberal leader in the hot seat to be able to answer, why did you call this election? Was this absolutely necessary? Could we have continued the way we were going until the other 2 years? He was getting support from other parties, and his mandate would have been continued.
Romaine, what are your thoughts?
I mean, in many ways, this election is really about the path forward. I mean, yes, Andrea, definitely not the ideal time for an election, especially seeing that we are really on the heels of either we could tilt over into a very terrible fourth wave, or we could emerge from the third better than what we saw last year going into the fall. And but we are there, and it's really about the path forward. I mean, we're talking about, is it going to be an aggressive agenda going forward? 2022 onwards. Is it going to be a progressive that we've already been seeing in terms of this moderate progression, Or are we going to see the conservative, or is that what Canadians want, the conservative path forward? And like Andrea said, they had support, but in many instances, the Liberals were being held up from both ends, right? We talk about the Conservatives blocking the conversion therapy bill ban for, or stalling it for a very long time. I mean, even with the budget, I mean, the NDPs essentially applied some pressure on the Liberal government to essentially institute some of their demands. And that is where it comes in again. Is it aggressive like the NDP? They want a real aggressive agenda to tackle climate change, to tackle affordability, to tackle some of the ills being faced by seniors and young people and indigenous communities and all that stuff? Or are we going to continue on the path of the Justin Trudeau government, where it is, as they said, promises and too long to achieve those promises?
Yeah. And
sorry to interrupt, Elizabeth. I want to say, Romain, you did forget to mention the other two parties. You mentioned Liberals, you mentioned Conservatives, you mentioned the NDP. I didn't hear you mention the PPC or the Greens.
And they're on the agenda as well, Andrea. My bad with that one. They're also on the agenda because as we're looking at the polls, their numbers keep going up, especially for the PPCs. But the Greens also have this stronger position in their leader this year. And despite the internal battles that she's been having from her party, she is leading a charge for the Green that, quite frankly, we haven't seen in a very, very long time since the party emerged. And she is in real contention to have some of those seats if she wants them. Well, she wants them, but if the people, I should say, if the people wants the Green to be one of those voices at the table with a much stronger voice, I might add, at the table, they have the option in the Greens. And like the PPCs, there are a significant fraction, and I say significant because 5% of the population, 4.9% of the population, you cannot overlook 4% or 5% of the population in the PPC. So they want someone at the table as well, and they do want someone at the table as well, because they're opposing vaccine passports, they're opposing a lot of the measures that are being proposed by the Conservatives, by the Liberals, especially by the NDP, and especially by the Greens. So this election, I think, is one that is so open in terms of where the votes might fall, and you have all autonomy this election to vote with whichever party that you choose to vote with.
Yes, and we know essentially this election was, called because the Liberal Party was looking for majority, but just mentioning having different parties have a seat at the table to call up these issues. For example, Green Party leader who essentially put the Liberal leader on the spot when it comes to women's rights and issues, sexual assault in the military, which, is an issue. And it kind of was, what were your thoughts on the response to that, Andrea?
That is one of the telling and non-telling answers. I appreciate that the Green Party leader asked that question. It is so important that women's voices be heard. We've had some serious concerns with the Liberal Party when it comes to how women are being treated. The Liberal leader called out some women specifically by name. And as you mentioned, in the military, some very, very serious concerns going on that are not, we don't think are being addressed properly. So I'm glad that she asked that question. And it should be clear to everyone on that stage that if elected as Prime Minister of this great country, it is their responsibility to protect everybody, men, women, all genders. Everyone needs to be respected and treated fairly, and all of their cases need to be handled properly and in a timely manner.
So I might just add on that as well. And I think this is a part of the turning point in Canadian history as well, where the next government will decide what that looks like. I mean, we have sheltered and kind of like cocooned the military for so long throughout history because they're doing this great service. And by no means am I diminishing the service that you're doing for our country. I mean, to serve and protect and to ensure that our borders are safe and us ensure that interests overseas are protected. But there are real evils that happen. And a part of that is mistreatment of minority groups. And we're talking about women, we're talking about racial groups, we're talking about members of the LGBTQ community. And the way forward is how we best, call that out and act upon it. I mean, we talk about increasing, that's the NDP and the Liberals and the Greens talk about, and also the Conservatives about increasing oversight. Right, but what kind of oversight are we talking about? Is it oversight where it's the military-run oversight again, where we institute a few generals and probably some female leaders, and they're the ones responsible for it, or is it civilians that are going to be a part of that decision making, or that oversight committee? And what are the consequences? Are they going to be sanctionable by the civil courts? Are they going to be only sanctionable by the military courts? Uh, we have to think about those issues, and when we talk about what truly fixing those issues look like, we have to think about it carefully and think about the platforms which best feeds into the vision that we have for correcting that.
Yeah. So then would you say it boils down to really just representation and accountability for the necessary parties, let's say?
I would say it's more on the accountability side. I mean, it is shocking that the prime minister didn't hear about, or the minister of defense didn't tell the prime minister about something of this gravity, like as soon as he heard about it. I mean, I don't know, honest, both the prime minister and the minister of defense being in that regard, but it is shocking if it is that the prime minister, in fact, didn't know about it when it first came out. It is a sad reality for the Justin Trudeau-led administration. Or if it's just that the prime minister didn't listen or didn't read the briefs or just didn't attend that meet. I don't know what happened internally, but it doesn't look good on the Justin Trudeau-led administration side for that issue at all.
Agreed.
Andrew, do you have any other thoughts on that as well?
I agree. It's about leadership. And I think policy is important, but also your character, your integrity, your ethics, and leadership. So in watching the debate, we saw 5 people stand on stage. That gave us an opportunity to evaluate them as leaders. Hear how are they open to working together and being collaborative with each other, hearing their leadership views. So that is something I hope that when people are going to vote, the ballots are open. You can go and vote now up until Monday, I believe. But when you are going to cast your vote, make sure that you are choosing who you think will be the best leader for the country.
And just to add on that as well, I think what we must also make clear is that there are very different agendas within each party, right? And we talk so much about collaboration, but let us be honest, the NDPs and the Greens, they don't always support the Liberals. So even in a minority, they struggle. The priorities of the Liberal government is not always the priorities of the NDPs and the Greens, and it's definitely not the priorities of the Conservatives, and definitely not the PPC. So when we talk about collaboration, it's collaborating on what issues and to which extent, right? We're going to talk about sick days, expanding Social Security. What does that look like? The NDP was calling for paid sick days for federal employees since the beginning of the pandemic, right? And now we're seeing it in the Liberal platform. After they had rejected it, I mean, with the budget, there was increased calls for increased spending on healthcare, community care. We're talking about on other safety programs, extending the CEWS, extending CERB, and all those kind of programs. And the Liberals essentially rejected it. But we must also be careful about that as well, because remember that we are a government operating within the world stream, and there are guidelines that have been set up. The IMF, the OECD, and also the World Bank did in fact say that as soon as the economy starts to open up, you should be winding down the emergency spending and start reforming those social safety net programs like the EI and like other programs. And we must give the hats off to the Trudeau government. They are winding them down as soon as emergency is coming off. So in that regard, I would say, they're on track with that a bit, but we must also be mindful of the fact that when the industries, service industries haven't been fully reopened, they might still need some of those supports. And that is when you should bolster all the programs that are out there, the emergency hiring program, and things of that, and programs of that nature.
Yeah. Right. But what I hear a lot from people, clearly everyone's campaigning and there are all these promises that sound like it is Christmas every day. Why all of a sudden now are you offering and promising these things when, if you're, let's say, the Liberal Party, you had 6 years to do all of this? Why are you offering more money for healthcare, housing, more money for premiers, more money for entrepreneurs? Why are you doing this now? You had 6 years to do this. The other parties, we all understand why they're saying if they get into power, this is what I can do for you. A, B, C, and D. Hearing it from the party already in power doesn't seem as sincere. Why are you offering this now? You should have done this before you called the election. So
in all
I
due
can
fairness,
see the
though,
struggle.
though,
I see the struggle
agree.
that some people have in watching the debate and in making their decisions, and the skepticism, and sometimes they say there's voter apathy, especially in our community. They say Black people don't vote. We don't go out there. We don't vote. You can almost understand, unfortunately, why there is some apathy, just the way the system is. But that's a valid question. All of these promises, Romaine, are coming now. What happened to last month or 6 months or 2 years ago? Yeah.
It is so true, but we must also be fair that federal transfers have been increasing at about 4% for the past couple of decades, for the past like 10 years, right? It has not been at the rate of that the NDP wants it to be at. And it is true. But remember also last year and during the pandemic, it was over 40 billion that was spent in healthcare transfer, 8 in 10 for the Liberals. Was federal spending. So we must also call upon the provinces to do better. I know here in Ontario, we haven't had the best. I'm seeing you here ready to take that on. We haven't had the best in terms of leadership from our provincial government. And essentially, the people had to be the one pushing the government to do stuff here. So this is the kind of partnership that I think that the federal government was hoping to get from so many of the provinces. BC stepped up, and BC stepped up in a very wonderful way for their citizens. Many other provinces did. We have Quebec who did the same in terms of even using their powers and ability through immigration to get more workers in for their long-term care and for their regular healthcare system. So when we say that the Liberals are promising more now during the election, remember they gave more, 43 billion point two plus they maintained that 4% increase in federal transfers for the healthcare. But more can be done. Absolutely, more can be done.
Yeah, more can be done.
So with that, what do you think was missing from this debate here in terms of policies, especially pertaining to, we're Black people, I'm going to say it, pertaining to issues that, affect us?
Well, let's just say the Conservatives didn't lead into this election cycle on the strongest footing, on any footing rather, with the Black community. First of all, that section was absent from their platform, so that was a big tell as to what the priorities in that regard will be. What also is kind of like the prevailing theme throughout their platform is the fact that they're bunching a whole lot of issues together in one. And they're not doing what is necessary. I mean, we heard from the central bank, you have to make those targeted investments because the recovery is not even, and the pandemic was not an equal, it didn't equally affect us, right?
Right.
So Black people were losing and marginalized people were losing their jobs at much higher rates. They were getting sicker at much higher rates. So the investments coming out of the pandemic must require that, there is this targeted approach to how we go about healthcare, how we go about returning those jobs in the economy. It must be about how we cater to things like mental health and the Indigenous communities as well, because the Indigenous community was having terrible footing before we went into the pandemic, and it got worse during the pandemic. We saw in BC an entire village was essentially wiped out because of the wildfires, and this is a trend that will continue. Right. So if we are not making those necessary and those crucial investments in those areas, we're going to see the lag in our economic recovery. We're going to see the lag in our social recovery, and we're going to see a lag in our general recovery as Canadians.
I agree. So I don't necessarily see anything specific in a Black lens or an Afrocentric lens, but I agree with Romaine. We need to make sure there is no lag when it comes to social services or getting the economy back on track. So we all are dealing with the same issues. We're dealing with affordability. So I live in Brampton. If anybody wants to buy a house in Brampton, you need to come with a truckload of money. Housing affordability is a big issue in Brampton and pretty much across the GTA where everyone is based right now. Also, when it comes to, I've heard some great talk about reducing rates, cell phone rates, cell phones, telecommunication, anything that's mandated federally like that, we appreciate. We also want to make sure that, the large companies, the large corporations, everyone's paying their fair share. We've heard record profits from some of the banks. We've heard record profits from some large companies that may or may not be Canadian that are not giving back to Canadians. So we want to make sure that, as a Black person, an Indigenous person, regardless of your background or your ethnicity, this all affects us. Affordability, making sure that you can trust whoever is in power, you have enough money to pay your bills. A lot of the income we receive right now, a lot of it goes to housing. We have housing, we have telecommunication bills, we have car insurance, we have daycare. There is like your paycheck is stretched. It is stretched. We need to make sure the government in power is helping us with that money that we are stretching.
Yeah, and even just mentioning daycare, childcare was a major issue during the pandemic, especially for folks who either had to go back to work and couldn't take care of kids who were off school, staying at home. And that was also discussed in the debate as well. But just, moving on to affordability, one of conservative leaders O'Toole's policies or platforms, shall we say, that he presented was, the Gst Holiday that a lot of people are questioning, like a month-long holiday on paying this tax. What were your initial thoughts when you saw that, presented during this campaign?
I can see where the conservative leaders trying to be innovative, but this is where innovation fails because and when you need to really sit down and listen to what the economists are saying, right? You need to really sit down and listen to what the economists are saying. As for Gst Holiday, what will happen in November, right? What will happen the month before when we have sales tanking for some of these companies where we're looking to really, get back on firm footing in terms of their financing? What will happen when in December when we have that rush to get to the malls, we have that rush to get to the stores, and pandemic control and all that stuff. So what the federal minister, what the federal leader could have done was probably institute. It would have been better if he had said something like, "We're going to reduce the GST by 2%, right, over a more sustainable period." But the federal leader is trying. I've seen a lot of growth. Let me say that in the conservatives platform, and it is partly a question that is largely in the political economy right now is the extent of the social state, the welfare state. Is it expanded, and to what extent will it be expanded? And that is one of those ballot for economists like myself. That is one of those issues. How much do we want the welfare state to establish coming out of the pandemic? We've seen it after every single crisis that happens, the state expands a little bit more, right? And are we going to move to this state like the NDP envisions, where healthcare is free, medication is accessible to all Canadians, daycare is accessible to all Canadians? Essentially, higher education becomes a part of the public education system. Or are we going to continue the path with the Liberals, where it is basically what it is now? Now they're promising to permanently reduce interest rates, which is a good move forward. But the NDP was calling for that a long time ago, right? The Greens were calling for that a very long time ago. So it comes back again to Andrea's sincerity question. How sincere is the Liberal government throughout this election? And I think the Liberal government has a lot of work to do in that regard as well. But as for affordability, there are some key things that we're looking at. Of course, we want to see those housing units built. 1.4 promised by the Liberals. The NDP is going to give us 500,000. The Conservatives want to give us just about 1 million. But what type of housing are we talking about as well? The NDP are leading in that regard because they've been increased call for things like social housing. Different styles and models are reimagining the housing model that we have for Canada. And the Trudeau government is essentially pushing forward their national housing strategy, which is apartment style, kind of like housing, and again, leading into some of those traditional housing units as well, repairs, especially in that regard. So when we hear of affordability, right, we are literally questioning, when I get my paycheck, how much of this will I actually get to enjoy? How much of this will I be able to put aside for the future if something happens? Do I need to have a second, third job while I have a 9 to 5 today? While I have a 9 to 5 as well. So that's just some of the things that we have to think about.
Yeah.
And I think during the debate, there was a woman, an older woman, who was saying that she is still working. She did not think she would still need to be working. She looks like she is, let's say, north of 60. Should our grandparents or our parents, when they're older, should they be working in their 70s and onwards? Should they not have enough security in their homes and just money that they can? They've worked hard. They've worked hard. They put in their time. They should be able to relax and sit back and enjoy a pension and enjoy, the rest of their lives. They shouldn't have to worry about housing. Housing and healthcare is not something any Canadian should have to worry about. Housing and healthcare, you should be able to be housed somewhere. And when it comes to healthcare and pharmacare, my parents, seniors, I am at the pharmacy on a regular basis. There are people who, thank goodness for people with great jobs and great benefits, because if you had to pay the full cost of some of the medication that a lot of seniors have to take, or even younger people for whatever condition you have, pharmaceuticals are expensive. When you take your prescription to your pharmacist, it's expensive. This is such a great country. We love Canada. We as Canadians should not worry about healthcare and housing. I think that should not be a concern for us. Unfortunately, for some Canadians, it is.
Yeah. And we know that.
And that too is a very double-edged sword as well. So sorry.
No worries, go ahead.
Because we're talking about even getting pharmacare together and getting, whatever is necessary to get pharmacare going. And a key part of that is, of course, passing that legislation that the Trudeau government has to draft in terms of getting those medication prices down. I mean, if we can save $3 billion by just getting the cost of expensive drug down, it is a significant savings before we march on to pharmacare, because that the government has to consume that cost. So what I think we need to do in that regard is follow through with that key piece of legislation to get that in, so we can get the cost of drugs down, because it's unfair. A lot of countries throughout the G20, they have lower, and the G7, well, G20, especially those Scandinavian countries, they have lower drug prices, right?
Yes.
And that is something we should be benefiting from as well. So if the Trudeau government can actually push that through, and I'm seeing, because based upon what is happening now, they're trending for the minority, right? But still lead. If they're the ones who are re-elected for third term, I hope they get those key legislation through so we can move forward with pharmacare, right? And then we even talk about affordability as it comes to seniors. Remember, the transformation in seniors policy was reversing that retirement age from, or GIS age from 67 back to 65, right? And of course, increasing the amount of money that goes into the guaranteed, the GIS program and the OAS, right, which was crucial to help so many of the seniors out during the pandemic and even as we emerge from the pandemic. And as you said, we do need more programs in place. We do need a better safety net for our seniors. And it trends towards the left to give us those better policies, because we look to the right and the right isn't offering much in that regard. Yes, we can talk about caregivers, giving them more money in their pockets. But of course, what about those seniors who want the independence of living by themselves, of not necessarily going into long-term care, right? So those options that we're exploring on that, and I think the NDP and the Liberals, they have the edge, especially the NDP in that regard, to delivering for seniors.
Yeah. On that note, we're going to take a quick commercial break, but stay tuned. We'll be back discussing the 2021 federal elections.
Do you want to be your own boss and make income or extra income with flexible schedule? Welcome to Keenan Courier. Keenan Courier works as a marketplace platform connecting customers who need something delivered with drivers that are willing to serve them. Courier with any vehicle, better trip allocation, and cash out your earnings whenever you want. Download our driver apps today to sign up. Do you
I just saw
Hello and welcome back to the Chat Up Show. I'm your host, Elizabeth Oloidi, and today we're discussing the 2021 federal elections. Now, yesterday we actually went to an event to hear a speech by our current Prime Minister and Liberal leader, Justin Trudeau, where majority of the speech was heavily focused on COVID recovery, essentially getting as many people vaccinated so that we can get back to out there, get back to work as much as possible and as regularly as possible and back to our normal life and routine. And just thinking of all the things that have we've discussed before and how much the pandemic has heightened and exacerbated a lot of the issues, especially when it comes to housing. We saw here protest of people protesting for the homeless population that was often shut down by our mayor in Toronto. And speaking of people who needed the CRB, and now, as we said before, we're coming off those emergency services as we're reopening the economy, so to speak, even more. Where do you stand in terms of your thoughts on the COVID recovery, especially moving forward? Because that is very paramount right now, and it affects a lot of the issues we talked about: long-term care home, healthcare. Our healthcare industry was severely impacted by the pandemic. And the changes that need to happen so that we don't face these issues going forward are so important and paramount to a lot of what the leaders should be talking about. So what are your thoughts on that? I'll start with Romain.
Wonderful. So COVID response definitely has to be centered on a mitigative kind of like lens for any further or future disturbance. I was happy to see in the Liberal platform that they're going to be dedicating some funds. I think it was 100 million or 10 million. I'm not really sure of the number at the moment, to study some of the long-term effects of COVID-19. And I would hope that that would cover everything that relates to, because we know of the respiratory kind of like side effects or like triggered kind of like symptoms of COVID-19, and to better mitigate what that kind of pressure that will have on our health system as well as on Canadians. So that was a good outlook. But COVID response right now, I mean, we have to follow the experts. I mean, the experts have given us so much brilliant advice that we must learn from. For one, the central bank has been a key part in informing us as to the path that is necessary and that is needed. I was happy to hear yesterday 90,000 jobs were recovered back in August. Before that, it was 75,000 in July. So we're on that recovery path. And they essentially projected that for us to get back to the pre-pandemic levels, it's about 550,000 more jobs that we need to recover. Depending on what we're seeing right now, or linking it on what we're seeing right now, we're on that track. So it is indicative of the fact that the necessary investments which were ruled out during the pandemic, as well as during the cabinet, and thanks to the support of the NDP and the Greens and the Bloc Québécois, I think we oftentimes call the block out because they really don't care about the general Canada, but they have been integral in supporting that Liberal government to deliver on some of those policies. I mean, when the Conservatives railed against the spending back in 2020, they stood up government, and the NDP, the Liberals, they formed a strong, and the Greens formed a strong coalition to deliver for Canadians. And that is what was needed. I mean, we listened to all the experts talk, and that is what is needed. So when I hear the Conservatives back then down in the policies and down in the spending, I wondered where they were getting their information from. And today we're seeing where those investments are actually paying off. I mean, we averted Great Depression, thank God, even though our numbers were into depressive states, but we averted a Great Depression. I mean, we didn't come close to what we saw in 2008 or 2009 when those financial markets crashed. But we are on a path to renew, and we talk about recovering from the pandemic, but also don't forget, recovering from the pandemic is about setting a future agenda as well. And as I mentioned at the start of the show, it's about whether we want to be aggressive, whether we want to continue, or whether we want to go back conservative. And what that looks like is essentially, doing what is necessary for Canadians, doing what is necessary to help us fight this pandemic, and put in mitigative steps. I mean, I read the PPC's platform, and they're like in line with the idea to abolish federal health transfer. And I'm like, after what we just witnessed in COVID-19, this is still something on the agenda. Everyone else is talking about increasing the amount of money that goes to the provinces, and they're talking about abolishing for some and giving them income tax. I mean, priorities are definitely something. We will always have different views in our economy, and we must always respect those. We must always respect different views in our societies. But there comes a time when we have to lead with facts, and we have to lead with the figures and lead with the proof that we have. And this is a such time where the state stepped in, the state helped, and we are reaping the rewards of that.
Andrea, any thoughts?
I agree with most of what Raymond said. The state does need to step in and help. Healthcare transfers to provinces, very important. And almost, how can anyone question? Every province needs support and help to help everyone in their province. The number one job of the government right now, whoever you choose to vote for, is to do what is in the best interest of Canadians. No doubt, one of the first things we need to do is stop the spread of COVID-19. So we're dealing with the Delta variant. I think I heard yesterday there's another variant coming. Our first job right now as a country is to stop the spread, reduce the spread of COVID-19. We need to keep everyone safe and healthy as possible. So making sure that we are continuing to promote public health guidelines and helping the provinces and helping all Canadians do what they need to do to stay healthy and continue living as well as they can. We need to slowly decrease the federal transfers, the CERB in that respect, but help people get to work.
Yeah.
I know that companies are starting to reopen. Businesses are getting back on track. The only way we will get through this, Romain mentioned we didn't have a recession, is we need to get people working. We need to give them money. We need to make sure there's jobs available. We can't lose any of our industry or lose any of our jobs. We need to make sure people have opportunity and access so they can get back to work, so that they can support themselves. We hear grocery prices are increasing. I heard meat's going up, produce is going up, all sorts of things are going up. We talked about pharmacare. If you don't have a great benefit program, you still need to take your medication. You need to make sure you have a job. And we need, as the government needs to make sure there are industries and businesses still standing. Make sure these businesses are still there so they can keep people employed, so they can remain in their homes, they can take care of their loved ones, and they can support themselves. That is the first job. Yeah. Slow the spread of the variant, get people back on track.
Yeah, and especially getting people back to work. There are so many small businesses who are deeply impacted by this pandemic. And just having that support there, so a lot of people were saying that, yes, it's great having the CERB there to help get you through month to month paying your bills. But then if your business had to fold, what are you going to do after when those emergency funds aren't being given? What support will they then receive after we've gone through the recovery from the pandemic? People who need to make sure that they're staying healthy. We even mentioned the long-term effects of COVID-19 that we're still trying to understand. Experts are still trying to understand these new variants. If still, again, going to say it again, it's been a topic of conversation why we're having this election now when we're still dealing with such pressing matters. So many lives were lost, sicknesses everywhere. We're seeing different reactions to COVID-19, and we're still dealing with folks who don't want to get vaccinated, who don't see why we need to be wearing masks regularly, why we need to still be socially distanced when there is vaccines available, when there are vaccines available, that we're still dealing with this pandemic, and it's not died down the way we'd like to see it go away, if I could say it that way. Yeah. But just now, transferring back, we kind of touched on it, especially Indigenous issues and the topic of reconciliation. We've seen the unearthing, I don't know if that's the right term to use, but the unnamed or sorry, I'm blanking.
Those unmarked graves.
Unmarked graves, there we go.
Yeah.
And the reaction we saw to that, it was shocking for a lot of Canadians to see this happening and unfolding, that each day went on, there were more graves that were found. And our Liberal leader was called out by NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh, who essentially said, you can take a knee one day, and then the next day you're taking Indigenous kids to court. How our government is responding to this, how we, even as Canadians, are responding to it. What are your thoughts on those particular issues that were presented during the debates? Andrea.
I'm disappointed that things haven't moved much quicker. It's heartbreaking. And I can't even imagine having being an Indigenous woman, having children, and somebody coming to tell you that they're taking your babies away, and something happens to your children, and you never know what happened. You don't know where their bodies are buried. It is heartbreaking, and it is tragic, and it is a shame. And now that all Canadians are aware of this, we must do better. We must be educated. We must remember, and we owe the Indigenous peoples of this country. The Prime Minister, and the government, I don't understand how we are taking Indigenous children to court. We can talk about reconciliation, but it's about action. What are we doing? So any government, any of those 5 people we saw on stage, if elected as Prime Minister of our country, owe it to the Indigenous people to do better. We cannot take people to court. We need to give them clean drinking water. It is unfathomable to me that in this country, there are people who don't have clean drinking water. We must do better. So I'm glad that this issue came up. I'm glad there was a reporter from APTN there asking these important questions, because we need to owe whoever the next Prime Minister of this country owes it to all Canadians and the Indigenous people to do better.
Romaine, did you have anything else to add?
I mean, I can't begin to understand the tragedy of loss and grief and pain and suffering that the Indigenous community felt throughout their existence alongside non-Indigenous Canadians. First of all, it was their land that was taken, their identity that was taken, their kids were then taken, and their essential, what they knew was taken, and they were left with just pain and suffering. And Andrea's right, they are owed so much. And it becomes very frustrating, it becomes very angering when we don't see steps towards reconciliation, achieved, right? We say we are walking the path, but the path seems to be long for no reason. The path seems to be very windy for no reason. I wonder if it's a back and forth kind of thing, 2 steps backward, 1 forward. But the amount of children that were found in unmarked grave, our government, Canadians as well, owe it to the Indigenous communities to listen and not object. We owe it to Indigenous people to give them the space to air their grief, right? And not say to them, let's move on. Because Indigenous schools did not end 400 years ago. The trauma that some of these families are feeling right now happened in the 60s, in the 70s, when their kids were in these institutions and they never came home. Right? So I could always add my economic and add my political lens to an issue like this, but I know better. I know better, and I will abstain from analyzing the situation, because analysis is not what is needed. What is needed is action.
Yes.
And if I can add, it is not necessarily up to the government alone to solve this problem. Clearly, there is a problem. We need to, as Canadians and as the government, humble ourselves and reach out and ask for help from the people we should be asking help from. The Indigenous community, the chiefs, the elders. We need to be working with them in collaboration. Ask them, what is the solution? How can we help solve this problem? Instead of imposing Eurocentric views and values on how we think this problem should be solved. There's a problem. We need to come up with a solution collaboratively.
Yeah, and just a point that you mentioned, that there's a lot of talk about reconciliation, but the action is what is really missing, and what we're looking to find and to see. And it's such a sensitive topic, because these are lives that were lost, and finding out that there are more lives that we hadn't even been able to grieve. Families weren't able to grieve properly because they did not even know where these graves were. They didn't know what had happened to their loved ones. It's sad that it's gotten to this point where we're kind of like horrified watching it all unfold. But as you said, it's also up to us as Canadians to also seek out how we can help to fix this issue, because it is a problem. And if we don't step up now, it's going to continue. Who knows what else could come forward in the future.
Exactly.
But just before we go, any last rounding thoughts regarding the 2021 federal elections, starting with you, Romain?
Well, as I said, there is a clear question that Canadians have to answer at this poll. Which path forward is the best for you, or you think is best for Canada? You can choose to go with the Green Party, led by the wonderful Miss Anne Paul. You can choose to go with the NDP, led by Mr. Singh. You can choose to go with the current Prime Minister and party, the Liberals, led by Justin Trudeau. You can choose to go with the Conservatives, led by Mr. O'Toole, or you can choose to go along with the PPC, led by Mr. Bernier. And that vote will decide what Canada looks like in 10 years, in 15 years, and in 20 years, right? So when we talk about the expansion of this social state or this welfare state that we live in, is it that we are just expanding the social, the welfare state, or is it that we're reorganizing our priorities? We hear Mr. Singh talk extensively about the tax the rich, make the rich pay, right? And is that the priority that we're going to go with, right? Where there is an equitable distribution of assets, right? Or are we going to continue on the path of negotiations and extending arms when they're essentially throwing back at the regular folks, right? Or are we going to go back to that era when the people didn't have a voice in politics and when Ottawa served only a few folks, right? And I think what the consensus is on the street right now is that most Canadians don't want it to be like that. Most Canadians want for there to be, responsible government. And when we say responsible, it's not just in the constitutional sense, but responsible to the people, right? Listen to the needs of Canadians and act upon the needs of Canadians. And we're talking about all Canadians. We're talking about yes or white Canadians. We're talking about Black Canadians. We're talking about Indigenous Canadians. We're talking about Indian Canadians. We're talking about Asian Canadians, all Canadians. So the ballot is laid out. As I said, this is probably the election that is going to have, or that has the most open ballot in our Canadian history. And you can literally vote for whichever candidate or whichever party that you choose to vote for. So go out there, polls are open. So it's my final call. Polls are open until Sunday for advance, and then election day, September 20th, for you to cast your vote for the candidate that will lead Canada in the direction that you want to see Canada go into.
Yes. And Andrea?
It is our right and responsibility as Canadians to vote. We have the privilege and the honor and the opportunity to go out there and cast a vote. Your vote matters. Many people think, doesn't matter. Who am I? I'm just one person. Your vote matters. You are a Canadian citizen. Why it matters is because you pay bills. You go to work. You may or may not have children. You want to make sure our air is clean, our water is clean. You have a place to work. You're able to get some employment. You can pay your bills. You want to make sure that we have a government that cares for Canadians, that cares for all Canadians, that represents us well on the world stage. We are dealing with climate change. We're dealing with increasing prices almost everywhere we go. You want to make sure you're voting for the right government that can work collaboratively with others and represents your best interests, not just the best interests of the party. So I encourage everyone to read everyone's platforms, go online, do some research, learn more about them. If there is a candidate in your area that you support, reach out to their office, call them, ask them questions. You have a right. You're a voter. They owe it to you to answer their questions. If there's somebody you support, reach out to them, help them canvassing, spread the word, call the Liberal leader, call every leader of every party if you have any questions and you want to learn more. That's your right. Make sure you make the right decision that is best for you and best for all Canadians. And like Romain said, you can go vote today. September 20th is voting day. I suspect there'll be quite long lineups, as everyone is reminded to bring their own pencil, and we'll be following all social distance protocol. If you can go vote today, if you've made a decision, go vote today. If you made a decision, go vote tomorrow. Just please go out there and vote.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Romaine and Andrea. And just a reminder that if you do want to go for advanced voting, polling's open until Tuesday, September 14th. And voting election day is September 20th as well. So you have until September 20th to make your decision. For more information, you can go to elections.ca to find out how to vote if you're still wondering. And with that, that concludes the Chat Up Show special episode today. As always, you know you can keep up with the GBCam network by watching live 24/7 at www.gbcam.tv or www.gbcam.fm. You can also download our free app to stay up to date with us right here at the GBCam network, and you receive a notification every time we go live. That's the free GBCam app available for all iOS and Android devices. You can continue to watch us on Facebook and YouTube at GBCam Network, where you can like, share, comment, subscribe, and you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at GBCam Network. And with that, I will be back at the regular scheduled time, Wednesdays at 1 p.m. for the Chat Up Show, and I will see you then. Take care.
You want to be your own boss and make income or extra income with flexible schedule? Welcome to Keenan Courier. Keenan Courier works as a marketplace platform connecting customers who need something delivered with drivers that are willing to serve them. Courier with any vehicle